Hey there, folks. I am back from my last road trip, which was to Pass Data Summit out in Seattle. Went to go speak there. A couple different things I spoke on or spoke about or whatever. So Pass Data Summit, if you don't know, is sort of was born out of the old Pass program that Microsoft used to have, but it was run by an independent company. And to make a long story short, especially as I couldn't say that I really know all the details, but the company that was running that folded during COVID, as a lot of event companies did. And it was most of the assets, I guess, and the machinery behind that were picked up by Redgate Software, which makes developer and DBA tools a lot for SQL Server, but also some for Postgres. And they had decided to put together a Postgres track this year. So I went to participate in that, spoke on a panel, did my, I think, like a Postgres talk, and was also involved in like a community AMA. So that went pretty well. It's a pretty decent sized conference. I think it's like 2,000 people or something like that. It's in the Seattle Convention Center. Got to meet a lot of people. There was more people there who I wanted to meet that I didn't actually get to. As I said, big conference and whatnot. So, but by and large, had a good time. I think it went pretty well. From a Postgres community standpoint, the other Postgres folks I talked with all seem pretty happy, and I think we're, eager, I guess, and optimistic that we'll get to do it again next year. So we'll see how that goes. I wanted to kind of get back to a little more question and answer in this round of video. So I've kind of compiled what is mostly best questions from past. One or two of these I also heard at Phosphor-G North America as well when I was doing that back in Baltimore. So just a few questions I'll cover up here, and then we'll do some bits and bobs at the end, and then we will all get on with our holidays, I hope. So first question was, and again, this one I've heard at other places, sort of different versions of this, but basically was like, hey, is there an easy way to get started with Postgres if I just want to like run a few queries, see how it works? And I think the question or the answer to that question kind of depends on where you're coming from to some degree. So if you're familiar with some kind of packaging system like RPNs and Debians on a Linux machine, that's probably the easiest way to get started. That's what I would probably reach for first, right? Like just apt-get install Postgres, like, and you'll get there. And that's a pretty easy way to do it. But for some folks, like that's not where they come from. Certainly, past we had a lot more Windows users, and there used to be a system called, I believe the system is still there, called Chocolatey, which is sort of like a Windows installer thing that you could use, kind of like Homebrew on Mac, but designed for Windows. But I'm not sure the state of the Postgres like versions and how active the maintenance is. They did have packages for Postgres in the Chocolatey system, but I'm not sure those are up to date. So one, like if you knew, let's say you really knew Docker, right? And you use Docker on Windows, like I would tell you like, oh, well, just go download the Docker one. I know those are up to date. Those are really easy to get. So if you're already familiar with Docker, like that's probably the easiest way to get up and going, just to play around with something. If you don't know Docker, then I would say like, don't confuse having to learn Docker with having to learn Postgres. Like you don't have to do both of those. So if you tell me you have no knowledge of how operating systems work or how to install software, then I probably would say some kind of combination of this thing called I think they call it the Crunchy Playground, or that's kind of what I call it, which is a web-based PSQL session that just runs in your web browser. If you go to playground.crunchydata.com, I believe that'll direct you to the right thing, and it basically just drops you into a PSQL prompt where you can create tables and run SQL and that kind of thing. And so that's like through a web browser. So like it doesn't get any easier than that, right? That's probably the easiest possible way to do it. And then I would say what you probably need beyond that, couple that with some kind of tutorial or something. There's a website, postgresqltutorial.com, which kind of runs you through the basics of the syntax and the language and whatnot. So if you just want to do some basic example stuff and write some queries, that will work for that. So that's probably the absolute easiest way to get going because you don't have to install anything, right? It runs through a browser and whatnot. But if you do have, like I said, if you know RPMs or you have like Homebrew, if you're doing it on a Mac, or even if you know how to spin things up in the cloud and that's easy for you, like everybody's got a Postgres system in the cloud, so just go to your cloud provider and spin one up that way if you know how to do that. And if you don't, like I said, there's there's other options like going through the browser and doing it that way. So that's probably what I would suggest as sort of the easiest ways to just like dip your toes in the water, like the very kind of basics of it. So, okay, another question. Who do you call when you hit a bug in Postgres and you can't open a Sev1 with the vendor? And I think that there are two answers to this. And the first one, I don't mean it to be snarky, it sounds snarky, which is you actually go open a Sev1 with your vendor. And the reason I say that is because in the Postgres world, most people actually do consume it through a vendor or have a vendor in a relationship, and they don't think of it that way. But if you go spin up RDS, Postgres, right, like you have a vendor, your vendor is Amazon. And if you hit something that you think is a bug, really, you should go report that back to Amazon, right? And they will try to verify if it is a bug. And if they find that it is a bug and needs to be fixed, they will take that back to the community, possibly with a patch, because they have folks on staff that do that. And that's true of, Azure and other companies. And I would say, so if you go to somebody like a Crunchy or Enterprise DP, I believe they have their own kind of cloud services. Or if you have a service provider, if you were doing something like Instant Cluster where you provision things, like they're your vendor, right? If you have a support contract through somebody like CyberTech, right? It's another company, they do Postgres services and support, like they're your vendor. So that's usually the best place to start, right? Go back to your vendor. However you got your Postgres, go there first, and I would say report the bug to them and then see where it goes. Now, you don't have to do that. There is another way that you can go about this, and some people prefer to go the other way. And certainly if you are kind of doing the DIY plan with Postgres, right, like, which is probably if you've downloaded like RPMs or installed it through Debian, you can go back to those maintainers, but you're probably better off going to the community for support in those particular cases, because they're volunteers, right? You're not paying them to build your RPMs for you. You are getting specialized built RPMs. There are some, Oracle actually provides Solaris RPMs, or not Solaris, PKG files. I believe they provide those. So maybe you are getting it from a vendor. In that case, you're getting package files and doing that. I would say go back to that vendor. If you're paying someone to give you a package, like go back to them. But let's say you're doing either building it from source, so you've downloaded it for free from someplace and you've got it running, or installed in Homebrew, like something like that. Now, in that case, what you do is you can go to the postgresql.org website and look under, there's a section for like, hey, report a bug. And there's a form that is on the Postgres website that you can fill out with your potential, bug information and whatnot. And if you submit that form, the only thing I say, be aware that that does not go to like a bug tracker or something like that. What it actually does is it turns that into an email, which gets sent to the PGSQL bugs mailing list. And there will be a number of people who will look at that. I don't know the current numbers. It must be in the thousands, I'm sure, that are on that mailing list. And people will look at and vet it and kind of email back and forth with you. Now, you could, of course, go to some other channel if you're not sure. If you're trying to figure out, like, is this a bug? Maybe you go to something like Slack or IRC or something along those lines. And you could ask there as well and say, hey, I think I found a bug. It's probably me. I would always suggest start with a phrase like, it's probably me, but I just want to make sure this isn't a bug, and then sort of describe your problem. There are people who, kind of jump on some of these forums and they're just like, this thing doesn't work and I don't need junky software and people need to fix your... Like, so if that's your attitude, like, that's why you should pay someone, right? To like go and take that abuse, I guess. I don't know. Seriously, if you approach it from like, hey, I'm not sure what the problem is. I'm not sure if this is a bug. Now, if you know it's a bug and you've confirmed it and you looked at the code and you have a patch and all that good stuff, like, hey, then you can, bring all that to the conversation. But otherwise, just approach it from a friendly standpoint. I'm trying to understand what's going on here. Maybe this is a bug. Maybe I don't understand. Can you help me? On those community support forums, you can get very good help that way. And so it's a fine path to take. But, I first would suggest to people, you're probably paying somebody for support or services or to provide you with your Postgres. And if you are paying those people, like, go back to them first, right? Use that support, make sure they're aware. And also it can help to rule out if the issue is something within their environment or their packaging, that is not in the upstream Postgres, because that certainly does happen. So, don't forget that. So not wildly different than other software in that respect. So, okay, another question. How often does Postgres put out new releases, and how do you know when to upgrade? So the first half of that question is actually pretty easy. Generally speaking, Postgres puts out a major release once a year. It's usually in, I would say, September or October, but figure somewhere around that time frame. And that's when a major version will come out, and that is all the new features and all the whiz-bang tools and all, everybody is happy with all that stuff. And then about 4 times a year outside of that, Postgres puts out a minor release, which is strictly bug fixes and security fixes. And they do that for all versions at the same time. So those are kind of the two release cadences to be aware of. Now, there can be additional releases that are interspersed within there. Most likely it would be, either like a very severe bug fix or very severe security issue that the sort of developers feel like should not wait until the next release cycle. Because maybe it's 2 or 3 months away before they're going to get to the next normally scheduled minor release, and they don't want it to wait that long. So that has certainly happened. That could happen again. Just be aware of that. So, but those are the normal cadences: once a year on the major version, and then about 4 times a year on the minor versions. The second part of the question is a little bit trickier on how do you know when to upgrade, and there's sort of a lot of different philosophies on this. I think it definitely is going to tie back to the nature of what you were doing with your Postgres as sort of the baseline, and how stringent you are around things like downtime and that type of availability. So if you're, some places I know, like you can do a nightly reboot cycle if you had to. And in those cases, I would say you should be very aggressive about your upgrades. Certainly the minor releases, Postgres considers it to be best practice to always run the latest minor release, because all bug fixes are cumulative through those minor releases. So, kind of as soon as those are out, like you just kind of schedule for whenever it makes sense and then go ahead and do those. And it's just bug fixes and security fixes. So, 99.9% of the time, it will not, be a problem to just do that upgrade, but you just need to be able to put the binaries in and restart it. And I say that as somebody who has been bit by that like 0.01%, where it actually changed some kind of behavior that caused me a problem. But by and large, like as soon as it's out, I basically just schedule it certainly within a week or, maybe even within a few days, depending on the number of systems you have to deal with, and just go ahead and start rolling out those minor releases. And so that's usually pretty safe. On the major version ones, it's a little bit trickier, because it usually involves a larger amount of downtime. It's not just a restart. So you have to do something like a PG upgrade, presuming you can have downtime enough for that, or otherwise you end up setting like some kind of replication setup or something, or maybe a dump and restore if it's a small enough database. Whatever that process is going to be, it's just going to be more time consuming to figure that out. And in those cases, like I would say if your database is small enough, or if you can afford those downtimes, like I know places where, if they need a downtime weekend or they get one like quarterly downtime weekend, I probably would be pretty aggressive about going out of those. Not the first weekend that the new major release comes out, but maybe by the .1 or certainly by the .2 release of that new major version. If I have the downtime and, especially if there's something in there that I really need, like I would certainly go for it. And I probably would just go for it anyways, because you get the performance improvements that just kind of come along with a new release. So, so that's probably the answer to that. Now, if you are a much more conservative shop or you cannot afford those downtime windows, certainly been in those scenarios as well. In that case, for me, I always look at like, well, there's certain versions that I find are like, these are kind of platform, like set a baseline. When it comes out, there's something in there that's so important or so critical, or just like it sort of sets a tone to me that like, these are the ones you should be on. 11 was a release like that for me. I thought that was really good. It is now end of life, in case you have not heard. 11 went end of life with the last set of minor releases that just came out a couple weeks ago. And so now if you ask me, so 12 is the oldest releases supported, but in my mind, everybody should be running at least Postgres 14. In this case, there are changes in how auto vacuum processes tables for wraparound, and its ability to not actually scan indexes. And I think that is such a potential sort of lifesaver. The ability that it can automatically do that process now makes it so much less likely that you would have a wraparound issue. That to me, like as soon as that was released, I was like, everybody should get to 14 like right away. Now 15 and 16, they're nice releases. There's performance improvements. If merge was the thing that you really needed for Postgres, like 15 is your guy, like that's great. for a lot of people, though, they've already worked around that problem, or they don't necessarily need it or whatever. So I'm not super hot on like you got to be on 15 or 16, but I would say if you're on anything older than 14, this is the thing. If you're anything older than 14, you should have been on 14. Now, when you're going to upgrade, probably just go to 15 or 16 to save yourself a future upgrade at some point. So I would say that if I'm going to do the pain, if I'm on 12 now and I'm thinking like, well, I've got to do a major version upgrade, you've got to test it. Possibly there's extension, stuff that you have to work through to make sure everything is supported on the newest version. But I would probably go to 16. That would be my plan, is to just do the major version from 12 to 16 and get it all out of the way with. No sense stopping at 14 in my mind. So that's how I'd kind of play that. So, but again, it's going to depend on how much downtime can you have, what's kind of the tolerance around these types of things for your organization and how you're using Postgres. So. Okay, last question we'll cover here. This one is a bit long, but I want to get into it because it definitely was a point of confusion I noticed at past Data Summit, and I've seen sort of versions of this question as well elsewhere. The specific part that was really past related is this idea of like, how do I set up clustered indexes in Postgres? And if you aren't aware, like in SQL Server, they have this thing called a clustered index, which basically means that the table is ordered on an index, typically the primary key, and that is used to keep the rows in the table in a specific order. In MySQL, this is known as index organized tables. That might be a term that's used in other databases. Postgres does not do that. Postgres basically has the main table is just basically, we refer to as the heap because it is just a heap, just heap data, like it's thrown in there in not exactly random order, but like, there's no particular order that those rows are in there. It just extends the files. And if you do updates and deletes, like those rows can move anywhere within the table. And there's no order to it in that sense. And then all indexes, from a SQL Server terminology, all indexes are secondary indexes in that world, right? Which means that they all have pointers back into the table. But even a primary key index is no different than any other index in Postgres. Like it's stored externally from the table itself, and the rows in the table have, there's no order to them, even with the primary key. All of that is handled through the primary key. And there's trade-offs as to whether that's a good idea or not, but that's the way Postgres does it, which is kind of the important thing. And then sort of there's a second half to this question, and this is the one that I've definitely heard more often from a wider group of people at least, which is sort of like when am I supposed to use the cluster command? And I think if you come from the SQL Server world, because they call their thing clustered indexes as opposed to like index organized tables, I think this more easily confused. Although I've talked to MySQL people who also thought cluster was kind of designed to set up index organized tables, but it really isn't. So what is a cluster command in Postgres, and what does it have to do with anything? So, well, the cluster command is basically a command kind of from back in the day. It's not used very often now, and I would tell you, like, by and large, there's not really a reason to use it. But what it does essentially is it takes the data in your table and it rewrites it in an order based on a particular index that you designate. So usually that, again, will be like a primary key, and the table data will be rewritten in the order that the primary key is in. And you would say, well, why would you do that? Well, it turns out that actually can provide performance benefits, if you have the data laid out in the same way that you might end up scanning it for query purposes. So you can get performance improvements that way. But the problem with using cluster for this, and the reason why people don't use it, is that cluster, it does not maintain this ordering over time. So you run the application, you run the command once, and it rewrites your whole table, right? Which may take quite some time, during which it actually does an exclusive lock on the table. So you cannot read or write data from that table, which basically makes it a non-starter for most people. But at the end of that, let's say you could run it anyways and you get it done. Your data is nicely ordered and fresh. If you have to then start doing updates or deletes on that data, then you will be essentially fragmenting those rows in whatever order those updates and deletes start taking place. Right. So because it's not maintained over time, then to me, it's like it defeats the purpose of why you would do this. You cannot count on the data to be in the order that you want it to be because it isn't maintained even after the cluster runs. Now, what's the use case for this? I mean, I think there were sort of different use cases back in the day when you might have been trying to optimize that way, or really more of the types of applications Postgres was in were not quite as demanding, like 24/7. I got to always have access to my data type environments. So I think it was more useful back then. The one case where I think people still use it now, and even this I think might be a little bit dicey, is that if you are doing like bulk data loads into a table where think of like an ETL process that would run as like nightly patches where nobody's accessing that data anyways as it gets bulk loaded, and you can put a cluster onto the end of that process, and so that it make sure it's written in the same order that you would want to scan it for your queries. So if it's part of like a nightly batch process, that's one way I've seen people use that, and it works well for that. Although I would also tell you, in many cases, it will be faster to sort that data externally to Postgres before you copy it in, and then copy that file. When you copy it, it's going to maintain the order that you feed the data in. So if you pre-sorted the data before you copy it, like you'll get the same effect essentially, and it'll be much less work on the database because you don't have to load the data in and then rewrite the data. But in cases where like, well, maybe I'm bulk, doing a bulk delete and then I'm doing a bulk copy in of some new data, and then I'd like to rewrite that to compact the table down as much as possible, as well as get it into the right order. I could see that use case. But again, it requires that you can exclusively lock that table while you're rewriting cluster. And there has been talk. So if you're wondering also, there has been talk of, I would say, doing like cluster concurrently. So if you think of like create index concurrently, so to be able to make it more of an online operation, even in that scenario though, it will not maintain it over time. And there really hasn't been any work pushed in that order. That would actually require essentially a new table storage engine, as far as I can tell, in order to do that. If you really wanted to be able to, have that maintained as rows are getting inserted and deleted. If you are like, well, if cluster concurrently would solve the problem for me, then I will point you again to our old friend pgrepack. Repack actually can do ordering based on an index when it is sort of recreating in the table and kind of rewriting it. Just be aware that the concurrent inserts and updates that are going on while the table is being rewritten, those will not necessarily be in that order, right? It'll be by coincidence if it is in that order, not by design. So Repack could get you most of the way there. And it would be just as good as a cluster concurrently, because I don't think cluster concurrently would go back and try to resort. You'd have to leave extra space on all your pages in order to like fit those in, and you'd have no idea where those pages were going to go. So you'd have to, kind of change some settings there within your table to make sure that you had, sort of filler space, which probably ends up loading the table and defeats some of the energy you might have got from cluster anyway. So the TLDR is, to me, like, just pretend like the cluster command doesn't exist and you'll be fine. But if you're looking for clustered indexes or index organized tables, Postgres does not have that feature. That's not how it works. So just be aware of that. You can stop looking. It doesn't have it. And so we'll see, maybe someday that'll be a thing that people do. But at least for now, that's not a thing. So, okay, that was the last question for this round. I've got two other bits and bobs I just wanted to mention. I did say at the start, we did a community panel at Past Data Summit, and it was basically kind of like an AMA panel for a bunch of community members, and I was on that. It was recorded, so I presume the video will be available at some point. Once it is and I find out, I will definitely try to mention it here. Or, of course, you can follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I will make a note there as well to let people know once that's available. So that's pretty much it for now. I have one more thing going on this year I wanted to tell you about. On December 6th, I will be appearing I'll be appearing on a podcast. I guess it's not exactly appearing. I will be on a podcast, the old Path to CytusCon podcast, talking about Postgres monitoring. And that will be at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And the way that they do that is they broadcast it over Microsoft has an open source, like, focused Discord server that they run with all kinds of projects in there, not just Postgres, but other open source activities that Microsoft does. But Postgres and the Citus team and that group is in there as well. And so they run that podcast. So if you want to join the Discord channel during the live broadcast, you can do that and ask questions, and we try to pay attention to the chat and answer the questions right as we're doing the podcast. So again, that's December 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern time, or in whatever time zone you are in, by way of time zone math. Or you can always listen to it later. I think it's in, as they say, all the podcast channels. So hopefully you'll join us and come ask some questions, or get something out of it. Should be a good time. Other than that, that is it for this session. I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. It's been a very interesting year for me. I hope you're getting something out of these. If you have questions, by all means, feel free to send them. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Consulting, did it for a very long time. I know I'm not charging now, so maybe it's not a consulting, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions I have about, or whatever you have about Postgres, if I can answer them. So that's it for now. Again, have a happy Thanksgiving, everybody, and hope to see you sometime soon.